of the Growth Commission. Shanker Singham, I thought Brexit was going to make people like Andrew's life up there in Whitehaven as a fisherman much better. And it doesn't appear it hasn't. Why not?
Yeah.
I speak as a Brexiteer.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to hear what Andrew was saying to Bev there, because what we did in the Growth Commission is looking at budgets for the UK. Three things need to focus on: tax, spending and regulatory reform. And the third thing, regulatory reform, is the biggest mover. So we've projected a budget that would give you about 28% GDP per capita growth over a 20-year period, which is huge, £15,000 for every man, woman and child in the UK over that period of time. Most of that, I mean a significant amount of that, is actually regulatory reform. It's exactly the issues that Andrew was talking about. How can we streamline regulations? How can we... they have actually imposed this growth duty now on regulators, so regulators actually have to consider economic growth, which is a step in the right direction. But, we need to do a lot more. We need to do a lot more on planning. Planning is a huge mover of these things right now. I mean, Andrew talked about the number of people he has to deal with. If you're trying to do anything with planning, building anything, not just housing, but anything, you have to deal with tens of different groups, statutory consultees, councils are worried about judicial review. I mean, there is everything in the system is designed to slow things down and stop things from happening, and we need to cut through that. So regulatory reform is important, but tax is important. I mean, I don't want to understate that targeted tax cuts, such as the ones that we've proposed, are very, very important.
Which tax cuts are you proposing?
Well, we've looked at the big three, if you will: corporate tax, IHT, inheritance tax, and income tax. And what we find is, if you're looking at, it depends on how long your projections are. So if you're looking at just 5 years, then income tax reduction is a bigger mover.
Right.
But if you're looking at the long term, pretty quickly corporate tax and even inheritance tax start to become bigger movers of GDP per capita growth. And one of the reasons inheritance tax, and we did some work on this in the Growth Commission, because people were talking about it, and we actually projected what the likely gain was going to be. And one of the problems with inheritance tax in the UK is our tax rate is very, very high. So if you look at a sample £3 million estate, in Ireland it's about 26% is the effective tax rate for inheritance tax. In the UK it's about 25.8. Most of Europe is 14, and the G7 group is typically around 7 or 8%. So we're way out of kilter.
And it's a pernicious tax, because we pay tax in it already.
And also what it does do, and it is doing, is causing people to make different decisions. It's linked to other things that we're worried about. So we're worried about the productivity of the country, and particularly how you get older people back into the workforce after they essentially left the workforce because of the COVID lockdowns. So how do you do that? Well, telling them that they're going to have to pay all this extra tax if they continue to work into their 50s and 60s is not the way to do that. That discourages them. So a lot of these things are interrelated: the tax, the spending, the regulatory reform. It's all interconnected. So I think productivity is the big driver that we need to...
But the moment you used the expression regulatory reform, you see people's eyes glazing over, and no government has embraced it, no government's engaged, and I don't see we're going to get that with the Labour government either, because it's about long term. All they think about is short term, getting through the next 6 months, the next year.
It's long term. It's also difficult, because the reality is that when you want to change something, people have been talking about planning reform, as you know, you have, many people have, for many, many years. Why can we not do planning reform? Because there are lots of people who benefit from the current system. And to get them to actually embrace reform, or to start to streamline things, to remove some of the powers of some of these bodies that sort of stand in the way of reform, requires two things. One is to show people what the cost, and that's one of the things in the Growth Commission we want to do. We want to show people, if you look at that 28% gain that we projected for over 20 years, about a third of that is just planning reform, just by itself, planning reform. So if you think about that, £15,000 for every man, woman and child in the UK, £5,000 of that, roughly, is planning reform. So you've got to show people this is the gain. This is what you're leaving on the table if you don't do this. And then you have to show people how to do it. And part of this is some of the things they have done, which is introducing this economic growth duty into regulators. I think every regulator should at least have that as part of their consideration. And economic growth shouldn't be confused with other things. There's a danger here also that economic growth gets confused with sustainability and net zero targets and all kinds of other things. We need to have a very clear view that if a regulator is thinking about economic growth along with other things, they should be thinking about primarily the effect on competition. We need a much, much more competitive economy. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about 99% mortgages. Well, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that in every other country in the world, or most other countries in the world, the idea of a fixed rate mortgage for 30 years is normal? Why do we not have that here?
We've got to go. That Shanker Singham, I wish he was doing the budget today, because I think it would be a little bit more constructive, a little bit more intelligent. We're going to go back to Bev Turner, who